Hello and welcome to the recap of the last week of the Undercover Policing Inquiry. This week we had 4 witnesses. On Monday and Tuesday we had the undercover police officer HN18, who used the cover name Simon Wellings to infiltrate Globalise Resistance and the Dissent Network. Then on Wednesday we had Maya, who was deceived into a long-term intimate relationship by the undercover police officer Robert Hastings, HN18. who used the cover name Rob Harrison to infiltrate No Borders, State of Emergency, Globalise Resistance, the Rampart Social Centre, and the International Solidarity Movement. Then on Thursday, we had 2 witnesses. In the morning, we had Atif Choudhury, who was, well, he didn't like the term, but a founder activist of the International Solidarity Movement, who was spied on by Robert Hastings, who was also a neighbour of Maya. And in the afternoon, we had Chris Nineham, who was Stop the War, Globalise Resistance, Socialist Workers Party activist, spied on by Robert Hastings. I thought it makes sense really to look at Simon Wellings and a little bit of Chris Nineham together, and then look at Maya and Atif together. I'm joined by Bristle KRS and Eveline Lubbers from the Undercover Research Group. What did you make of what we heard this week? Starting with you, Bristle.
I think the main thing this week was just the powerful testimony from Maya. She really put a really clear human face to what it's like to be targeted by these people. I think it was really powerful and it cut through so much of the jargon that we're used to. Wellings was also a lot of interesting stuff in terms of exactly what he was doing with his time, especially on the second stint. And then again with Atif Choudhury and Chris Nineham, again, astonishingly, it's as though what the spycops are reporting bears almost no resemblance to reality in terms of what actually happened. So a good week for evidence, I think, in terms of showing some clarity for what is supposedly intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely. Eveline, what did you make of it?
My screen seems to be flashing. Do you see that as well?
No.
Okay, that's okay. I didn't get the memo, apparently, about the black T-shirt with yellow prints. Both of you wearing.
So what do you make of this week at the Undercover Policing Inquiry?
Sorry. Yeah, it was like Maya, of course, was so impressive and so like very, very disturbing in the sense that we always say that, you know, every next undercover officer is worse than the one before, but just in a different way. And what we're about to hear from Rob Hastings next week, I think, will be, I don't know what to expect, but he really it was really an abusive relationship that she talked about, and was so very powerful that she came and actually talked about everything. And it must have been very difficult for her. Simon Welling, if you look at this reporting, Wellings, sorry. So, I was generally very underwhelmed by what he submitted. This is mostly like stuff copied from mailing lists and from the internet. And his appearance was, you know, in the same way, very underwhelming. He didn't have much to say, in fact.
So, I mean, just looking at I think there was quite a bit in Simon Wellings, really. I think the most significant part was the MT, the fake bomb vest stunt. We heard quite a lot about it last week when we heard the live evidence of Guy Taylor and Noel Douglas. This plan to embarrass Ariel Sharon, the Prime Minister of Israel, when he visited the UK. Something which was thought up in a pub by a white man in his 40s with a background in theatre, which is then jacketed by Simon Wellings onto a much younger Asian man who he reports as being Arab. The person we call MT, we heard from MT last week as well. This story came up, I mean, most significant, as well as there being like numerous reports, all of which got more fantastical. We also had this value for money document, which we were very looking forward to Simon Wellings justifying. He was presented with it, and he, I mean, essentially just went, yeah, it's all been massively exaggerated. I didn't write this. There were lots of versions of this document. This is towards the end of the existence of the SDS. And there was a real desire by some of the management to try and keep the unit going. So they were sexing up, gilding the lily, whatever you want to call it, what my deployment was. And that's what this document is. I don't stand behind huge sections of it. He was then taken through it, and then sort of line by line, he kind of just disowned any bits that he couldn't really justify himself, which, I mean, made for a very... I mean, it was just like I mean, cherry picking in the most extreme version of. I think this was. I think the MT stuff was the most significant. I mean, not least because at the very end we have his questioning on the Tuesday afternoon. We had something I don't think we've ever had before from the chair, where he put it to Simon Wellings. Well, cover name Simon Wellings. That he'd heard evidence from MT, from Guy Taylor, from Noel Douglas around this incident, and and after hearing Simon Wellings' evidence, he had no reason to disbelieve them. And he said to him, if it's never too late, here's your opportunity. If are you absolutely sure it was MT who did this fake bomb vest plot? And he didn't hesitate. He said, yeah, absolutely. He was 100% sure. He was 100%, what was the term he used. I think this undermined all of his evidence. But, I mean, so much of his evidence just hadn't been believable in the first place. There were too many... Like, he claimed he hadn't seen anybody else's evidence, that he hadn't read the written statements by other witnesses. Yet he kind of brought up anecdotes that were direct responses to what they'd said. There was a couple of... I mean, his sort of claims about, like, turning down sexual advances. There were two scenarios which were just entirely fictitious. They were the most things that have never happened in the history of things that have never happened. Totally unbelievable. I don't know, what did you guys make of his adamance on the MT stuff?
I think what I said underwhelming earlier. I think the lying and the really trying to wriggle out of things was so sort of cringing to look at. Like, it was so clear that he was lying. It was so clear that he was telling totally different stories than even Mitting thought that the civilian witnesses were very believable, which is something, as you said, that he has never done before. I don't know. Every time we have like an undercover officer as a witness, do you think there must be one that has thought about what he's been doing and has sort of, after all these years, has sort of recapitulated, has like sort of evaluated it, and may say like, it was, like what I did was not good. It was sexed up. It was like to please the managers, but not lie in such a sort of enormous way all the way through. I think this is very sort of a bit of a disappointing thing of the entire procedure.
Yeah, I think one of the... Sorry, I was just going to say, in terms of when Mitting was giving him the opportunity to consider that maybe he misremembered or was honestly mistaken, there was air that Mitting was putting there, just willing Wellings to come forward and step into it and just say, "Okay, yeah, no, I'm with you there. I probably just misremembered it. I've got to." it was an honestly held belief, but I made a mistake. But no, doubling down on that. And then in parallel, the whole issue of talking about Kennedy being with an activist woman and dredging up it was Kate. The name Kate was mentioned. And it felt like he was unable to just let go and give honest testimony. Instead, he was still coming up with stories, and it felt like even Mitting was seeing that this was not a convincing witness in front of him. So in that respect, I thought that Wellings was an interesting and a good witness for anybody following the inquiry, but he did not come across as an honest or a good intelligence officer. I think he just came across as Baron Munchausen, really.
I think that stuff about Kate. It was particularly nonsensical. Just for the context, so there was a report in the written statement of HN72, which is one of the managers, who hopefully we'll be hearing from in June, July. HN118 reported back to them that whilst at the G8 in Germany, that they had witnessed both Mark Kennedy and Marco Jacobs, two undercover officers in the National Public Order Intelligence Unit, he believed them to be in relationships with women. And when that was put to him, he said, oh, no, he was asked this by HN72. He said he didn't know that he could believe it of Mark Kennedy because he'd seen him with a woman repeatedly, but he wouldn't believe it of the character of Marco Jacobs. Now, frustratingly for me, my first attempt at putting a Rule 10 question in for the inquiry was, what was it that he knew about Marco's character? Obviously, Marco Jacobs was the undercover officer who spied on myself and the group I was part of, including having sexual relationships with two members of our group. But annoyingly, that wasn't asked. But what he was asked was, could he write down the name of the woman who he had seen Mark Kennedy with? Now, by that point, the woman he was in a long-term relationship with, though he was polyamorous and was associating with a lot of different women, Mark Kennedy was in a relationship with a woman we were calling Lisa. That wouldn't have been the name he wrote down, but we were expecting the name of who Lisa actually is to be the name written down. The name he actually wrote down was Kate. And when pressed on it if he meant Kate Wilson, he was, oh, yes, I think it's Wilson. I think I've seen her in the press since. Now, the massive flaw in this is that anybody who knew Kate Wilson during this time period didn't know her as Kate. No one knew her as Kate. She had a different name. She's using her real name these days because, we've all lost our kind of ability to pretend, to use false names with the nature of the inquiry and everything else and the court cases. But back then, no one would refer to her as Kate. It was obviously a lie. It was obviously something that he'd made up, that he'd pieced together from information that's been in the public domain for the last 15 years and wanted to make it sound like he was clever. He was obviously bullshitting. It means that I think that pretty much everything that he talked about really is like kind of undone by both the MT stuff, but also, I think, the Kate thing really drove a coaching horses through his evidence, really, didn't it?
Yeah.
Another big area of his questioning was the accidental voicemail. Where he accidentally called an activist whilst he was doing a debrief with some desk officers. There's not much really to add to it, to be honest. The fact that he made a mistake about the identities of two female activists within the group, just getting their first names mixed up, who was who, kind of showed that he, underlined his poor quality as an intelligence officer. But just the whole thing. He called it a schoolboy error, which very much. It was interesting. On day one, really kind of focused on his infiltration into Globalise Resistance, and then day two, they looked at. It was interesting. At the end of the day, they said to him, "It's like you went from infiltrating Globalise Resistance, and then next." And he said he put himself in a position to be able to report on dissent. He didn't say that he infiltrated dissent. And certainly we see from the reports, from people's memories as well from the time, there was a statement put in by members of dissent, including myself, about the fact, I mean, I do have one memory of him, which annoyingly wasn't brought up. I mean, I guess it was because it was in Germany. But yeah, despite there being him reporting very, very extensively on dissent, it appears he did not infiltrate the group at all. He went to like large public events, he went to protests, he went to open meetings, he joined email lists, he volunteered and did some work, kind of like delivering things, picking stuff up, some leaflets, some stuff for veggies, doing the kitchen, volunteered in the kitchen in a couple of places, supposedly helped out in the Counterspin, which was the media centre for the anti-G8 mobilisation in Scotland. But I mean, largely managed to make himself like this forgettable character on the periphery, which is kind of, I mean, like, so we know him to be the highest paid SDS officer ever. We also know that he filed 4,000 reports. And given his lack of like closeness to his targets, it was kind of quite interesting to see what was in those reports. And what we actually found was just huge amounts of copy-pasted material directly from the internet, directly from email lists. Often, a lot of repetition. Multiple reports, filing the same information that was already held, people's phone numbers again and again. I mean, it really, undermined again his role as an intelligence officer. But I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that his report on MT, claiming that MT was a young Asian man who was going to feign a suicide vest attack on the Prime Minister of Israel, was really like, it was one of those things that I am sure that once that report was in the system, that it was reported higher up, along the line to to politicians and so forth. They lost the fake part of the fake bomb vest report. I mean, this is yet another piece of information that the state can turn around and say, well, if only you knew what we know, then you'd be much more concerned and you'd think it was perfectly justifiable that we beat the shit out of these protesters because they're very dangerous and they're about to do something very serious. And we've got all sorts of intelligence reports that show that we foiled all sorts of plots that were going to bring people into lots of harm because these are dangerous people. And I think, it's things like that. And we've seen so many other things like it. I mean, I've mentioned before about, the Operation Lime, James Thompson setting up L3 in the south of France, the Carlos Iraqi setting up, attempting to set up no platform activists for firebombing the fascist bookshop, going back to Bob Lambert with setting up his own cell of the Animal Liberation Front and firebombing McDonald's, firebombing Debenhams. I mean, this is a huge part of what they do, kind of creating. We also saw, we also saw a bunch of stuff about disruption. One of the things that came out of the accidental voicemail exposure was that in the notes they say we considering taking a destructive approach and destroying Globalise Resistance in the aftermath of this. Now, he claimed not to know what this meant. He said that he never was disruptive, but again, we keep seeing these little whispers, these little sort of references to disruption. And I think it's very clear to any regular watchers of the inquiry that these undercover cops, it wasn't just about public order. It wasn't even about subversion. A huge part of it was about disrupting, undermining, and destroying social movements. I think we saw some smoking guns for that this time.
Yeah, I think it's also important to notice that, in fact, he sort of blew up his own cover by that mistaken phone call where someone was able to tape the debrief that he was doing from their voicemail. When Globalise Resistance realized what was on that tape, which is very difficult to, we've heard the tape as well, and it's a recording of a voicemail which is very sort of difficult to understand. Like you said, he was asked the identity of people from a photo, and he made a mistake. But in fact, that blew up his cover. He exposed himself, and it's within Globalise Resistance. We've heard that last week. It took a while to realize what they had heard and what that meant, and they confronted him, exposed, and sort of, he claims there were tears and people were crying when that happened, and he kind of disappeared after that. But he wasn't pulled from the deployment. He was which I find difficult to understand from the STS point of view, but also that he apparently felt secure enough to keep moving in more or less the same field, moving to dissent. Like you said, he wasn't very deeply infiltrated, but he was still going to meetings, going to events, going to demonstrations. People who knew that he had exposed himself could have seen him. It was quite a risk, and that wasn't really addressed during the hearings. And also,
just on that point, I think partially because the way that he kind of insert himself into dissent was not to be too prominent. I would say that, as much as Globalise Resistance positioned themselves as an anti-globalization, anti-capitalist network, kind of aiming to supposedly go for the same things that we were in dissent. I remember seeing them from time to time from a distance, but we were existing in very different planes, I think, most of the time. There wasn't a lot of crossover at all. I know when this first came out, there were a lot of people that were quite angry with Globalise Resistance for not highlighting to other networks that they discovered this what they believed to be a police informer. But I can't say I really blame them for not noticing that he was around to the extent that he was in dissent, really. I think we were at very different planes at the time. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, there was also
one
the
thing
issue
that...
Go on.
Sorry, I was just going to jump in there and point out that at the time, Globalise Resistance was an informer, a paid informer or similar, or anything more serious than that. It's only subsequently that it's been clarified, the position of Wellings. And also Globalise Resistance and its relationship with the SWP puts them in a position where from the...
Whoops.
Oh, we've lost Bristle there. I was just going to kind of go back to this point about disruption and the way in which a big area that Wellings was questioned about was the forward intelligence teams. Oh, there we are. You're back again. Sorry, Bristle, did you want to finish making your point? We kind of lost you halfway through then.
Sorry, I was just saying that as well as the issue over it not being clear
you're breaking up again.
Of a police officer, there's also the issue that Guy Taylor spoke with senior members in the SWP to say that they'd kicked out someone they thought was an informer. So presumably that information would have been fined back to the SDS and Special Branch via other means as well. So that potentially would have been giving them enough information that the SDS as a secret police unit was still protected from exposure, which, as we've heard before, is one of the prime considerations they have in terms of pulling people out where there's an accusation that someone is a police officer. There seems to be a lot more action than as with Wellings, where there's a suspicion that he's an informer. So I think that is perhaps one of the issues where they've invested all of this time and resources into Wellings' operation, that if they just redeploy him elsewhere, then they're getting VFM. And as we've heard, VFM is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a fair enough point. I'm personally, I'm not too angry with Globalise Resistance over this matter, really. But one of the things I did want to bring up was about the disruption, and we talked about the way that Wellings was asked about the disruptive element of the undercover police, but also he was questioned about the FIT, the forward intelligence teams. We heard this really being raised during the questioning of Jason Bishop, and I think it's something that we'll hear a lot more about next week on Monday when we hear the questioning of Emily Apple, the activist who was targeted very heavily by FIT. And interestingly enough, Simon Wellings was adamant. He was very clear that the whole point of the FIT was disruption. This was about disrupting activists' ability to mobilise and organise. And essentially, they were very much, trying to intimidate people out of engaging in political activity, really. I mean, we saw stuff in Wellings' reports. I mean, admittedly, they were from copy and paste, but it was talking about how individual activists were being stalked and harassed by the FIT. I mean, I think this is a really key area, and I think this is going to. I think when we come to Tranche 4, I think it's really key that we call for the inquiry to be calling FIT officers to give evidence. I think that they are the key kind of third party when it comes between the undercover police and the activists that were being spied on. They were the professionals who were there at a huge amount of the time, not just at protests, but at meetings and social events where they were outside filming. They made it very clear to us individually when they would shout over at us and attempt to engage us in conversation, that they had a huge level of understanding of our personal private lives. And I think it's fair to say they almost certainly had, a very good understanding of what the undercover officers were doing within our groups. So I mean, I think it really is key, and I think the questioning of Wellings kind of brought up the way in which the undercover police were very aware of what the FIT were and what they were doing. And I think it's really key for Tranche 4 that they're called as witnesses. I don't know what you both think about that.
Well, I do think that it has become clear, or when you think about it now, is that loads of the intelligence that they had must have come from the SDS, because they were able to identify people, to like you said, to speak to them, calling them by their names, knowing where they lived. So we haven't heard a lot about that yet. The FIT teams as clients of the SDS. Intelligence gathered by the SDS, and in that sense, I totally agree that they should be called as witnesses, because it's like also it is like a part of the bigger scheme of things. It wasn't just the undercover officers undermining the groups. That was just one of the things that like making it impossible to do an action or to be at a demonstration without being followed around or photographed is another part of repression, of undermining protest, while heavily public order policing is yet another, that is a complex that we need to see all sides of.
Yeah, I think like the actual experience of being policed by both the National Public Order Intelligence Unit and the FIT. I think that the experience of the FIT was probably more horrible in the moments. I mean, in retrospect, I think the NPORU was probably worse for my life. But the experience of being policed by the FIT was particularly unpleasant. I think you're absolutely right about the greater level of political dissent that came from that. But I think within the terms of reference of the inquiry itself, there's plenty of good reason to recall the FIT. Sure. Because I think they ran their own informers. I think there was a fair bit of evidence of them running their own informers in terms of getting intelligence. I'm sure they were clients of the NPORU and the SDS as well. But I think they were just witnesses. I think they were witnesses to a lot of the activity of undercover officers when it comes to relationships and other things like that.
Sure.
One of the things that came up when we had on Thursday afternoon, we had Chris Nineham. Now, Chris was meant to be giving evidence the week before on the Tuesday. So it was a bit of a strange situation, because normally you have a state of affairs where the civilian witness is questioned about an undercover officer, and then the evidence that's gathered from that is put to the undercover officer. It was very much the other way around for Chris. I will have a similar situation with Emily Apple on Monday, though I think there's a lot more other information to come out from Emily's. But one of the things that the sticking points, the only issue for which John Mitting intervened in the questioning of Chris Nineham was around the intelligence requirements for the visit of the US President George Bush back in November 2003. When he visited London, it was on a weekday. There was the biggest weekday protests in British history. And there was a lot of questions asked about, were the police fully briefed about the size and the scope of the demonstration that's going to take place? And there were a lot of very foolish questions, I felt, about whether the undercover police were needed to get the information about how big the protest was going to be. The chair asked Chris Nineham, who he had negotiations with. Now, of all the negotiation processes that have existed between activists and the police before a large event, I would say the most famous of these would be the November 2003 visit of the US President Bush. There were press conferences outside Scotland Yard. There was a lot of to and fro in the media about it. These events are a matter of public record. I mean, I was in no way involved in any sense, but I remember them happening. Yet the chair felt the need to question Chris Nineham on who did you meet with, who were the actual uniformed police officers. Simon Wellings, the undercover officer, for his part, claimed that it had been him who had impressed upon his managers the need to let public order know that it was going to be a much larger demonstration than they were expecting. Chris Nineham was unequivocal. He said that they had been saying that to police in the negotiation processes in the weeks and months leading up to the demonstration. This appeared to be the only area which the chair had any sort of real interest, to be perfectly honest, in the majority of what was being asked of Chris Nineham on Thursday afternoon. I don't know what you two thought of Chris's questioning, if there was any other issues within it that seemed to be of interest to the inquiry at large, or the chair in particular.
Not really, but what I did notice is, and that is like also compared to or put next to the question of Maya, is that the chair is particularly interested in people who are not totally against the police. So for him, it's like it's a very special thing, apparently, that people negotiate with the police or that they are open to talking to them. He's very much in a sort of we and them kind of thing. And he thinks there's like, like every civilian witness is sort of, it's just there to, to demonize the STS and the undercover policing and the police in general.
To go back to Simon Wellings, is there anything else about Simon Wellings you want to say before we move on to other topics? Anything else about Simon Wellings? No?
No.
Okay. So, I think like Simon Wellings, I think, in many ways, he's been, called an Inspector Clouseau in a Guardian article that was published today.
I was just going to say that many of the instances that are of most note with the Wellings evidence is how many times he was making mistakes, and yet he was in the field for so long. He was submitting so many reports. So mistaking activist A.
Oh, it's very difficult, isn't it? His connection. Can't hear you.
Who's that to, Eveline?
Oh, I can hear you. Do you want to have a go? Bristle, do you want to go for it? Okay. Maybe Bristle can rejoin it. I don't know if he can hear us. Can hear bits of him, but yeah, we lost him again now. Just looking at Maya, then, I mean, I would say that yeah, her evidence on Wednesday was probably one of the hardest days at the inquiry. Incredibly difficult testimony to listen to. Incredibly disturbing, very, very graphic. A lot of detail of the sexual abuse that she received at the hands of the undercover police officer Robert Hastings, who, using the cover name Rob Harrison, was deployed to infiltrate the international solidarity movement, No Borders, the Rampart Social Centre, State of Emergency Collective, among other things. He used Maya's history of being raped to fuel an irrational jealousy, graphic insults accusing her of infidelity, and of enjoying the sexual harassment she used to receive at the hands of men. Deeply, deeply disturbing in every way. We saw huge numbers of emails, Skype messages that he sent to her that were just deeply disturbing. Part of me doesn't really want to go through the detail of it because it is so personal and so graphic and so upsetting. I don't know, Eveline, do you want to say something about the abusive nature of the deceptive relationship that Robert Hastings perpetuated?
Yeah, I've got the same feeling as you have, that I just don't want to go back there. But on the other hand, we need to, because this was just an abusive relationship. He would just, the way she explained it, he would just come to her house late at night, announce himself like 10 minutes before, would then come to her house, have sex like within 15 minutes, and that was their relationship. Basically, she said at a certain point that she fell in love with the individual who sent her text, and was like, could be very nice and charming and making compliments.
I mean, just to say that the quote was that it felt like there were three Robs. There was the Rob who I met in person, who turned up late at night, just wanting sex immediately. There was the second Rob who sent me flowery emails. This was the Rob that I fell in love with. It was full of poetry and made me feel special. Then there was the third Rob, the one who sent me offensive messages, accusing me of infidelity. She talked about the difference between those three, of never wanting to confront the Rob she met in person with the one who sent her messages, who was so abusive and vile, but that being so different to the one that she came to love, who was the person who sent her these. And we saw them, they were very quite long-winded, quite flowery. Obviously we saw the ones that concentrated on the abusive nature of things, but there was a lot of poetry, there was a lot of depth to these very long documents, these very long emails that he was sending on a regular basis.
Yeah, so she was kind of caught up in this very abusive relationship, which, as we see so often, like in other cases, there's always a good side which you hope will prevail eventually. But it was very clear that in this case that it wasn't going to happen. And one of her main problems with the relationship was that he would never have time for normal couple things, like go out to dinner or go to the movies together, or stuff like that just didn't happen. It was even so that we were going to come to that, because he got to know her because she lived next to someone he targeted, who he also visited at, unprompted and 2 or 3 times a week. When these people who had Atif, who gave evidence as well, organized a surprise birthday party for him at their house, he didn't bother to invite Maya as well while she was at home at the same time. So he kept for her, in her feelings, he kept the relationship he had with her secret. And it was only later that she confided it to Atif, who was like she said felt like a big brother to her, that she started to confide how much she felt hurt by him, and then specifically afterwards, when he left, when he just disappeared like all the other undercovers, she was like more open to Atif about what had happened. And well, you said you wanted to discuss Maya and Atif together. Like, Atif is a very good example of how not just the sexual relationships, but also undercover officers building very good and deep relationships, friendships with their targets can also hurt people, and in all kind of ways, because like he explained how after he disappeared, they still missed him, and he was still part of their lives, that he wasn't at marriages or at other big events, and that currently he has like it's very difficult for him to sort of merge those two pictures of Rob, the friend he thought he was, and what he has heard about him since and knows about him since, are both in a relationship with Maya, but also the fact that he was spying on him and reporting on him, and that has had a very big and deep influence on his life. I don't know how much was part of a restriction order, so I don't want to go into too many details of his personal.
Yeah, please don't. Please don't. Please don't. If you please don't go into anything like that. Yeah, I think it's noticeable and important to point out that Robert Hastings did not cease his abuse of Maya when his deployment came to an end. The emails that he was sending her continued for another 3 years on a fairly regular basis. Before then, 4 years after, so his deployment ended in 2007. The emails continued in 2010. And then in 2014, he got in contact with her again. She was in another relationship by this point, a much more supportive one, though one that she didn't feel was leading towards marriage or settling down. Once again, Robert Hastings lavished a huge amount of praise and essentially love-bombed her, encouraged her to leave the relationship she was currently in. He told her that he had never been with another woman since that he had been with her, that he made out he was living a very pathetic and sad life. Obviously, he was married with children, all these undercover officers were. He convinced her to leave her partner. He made out that they were going to be together, that he was talking about buying a property, about them moving in together, about them starting a family. As it turned out, he met up with her for sex once, an incident that, I mean, I don't want to be too graphic, but the details of it are something that he disputes. So we were forced with the horrible situation of Maya describing the way in which he convinced her that it was okay that they didn't have protection, that he would use the withdrawal method. As it was, he didn't do that. He fulfilled a fantasy that he had been talking about extensively in the messages that he'd been sending her. He then disappeared without trace and never spoke to her again. We saw the really upsetting message that she sent him the next day, just saying she was looking forward to seeing him again, that she'd been for a morning after pill, that it was all quite stressful, but, you know, these mistakes will happen. And she looked for, you know, she cared about him and was being quite flattering about him. And it just shows the way in which this, I don't use the word very often in life, but this thoroughly evil man was abusing this quite vulnerable woman. We heard it in detail during her evidence of the vulnerable state she was in before he met her. And it was something that he clearly preyed upon. I think there was a lot of parallels with what we heard about James Thompson. I think this man is a predator, someone like James Thompson. I don't believe this is the only woman he's done this to. There was too much calculating behavior in the sort of the nature of the abuse. deeply, deeply disturbing. And yeah, Atif Choudhury then the next day on Thursday morning gave evidence. He was someone who got very close, who Robert Hastings got very close to. He was someone who had been like a key part of the early days of the international solidarity movement. He was someone who'd been to Palestine a number of times. I heard from Mesa Winstanley, who's a journalist who works in the Electronic Intifada, talking about when he first got involved in that kind of activism around Palestine solidarity. Atif was a bit of a legend, you know, and is clearly someone who Robert Hastings was tasked against. So I mean, he even though that Atif was no longer involved in ISM meetings, to read Robert Hastings' reports, it made out he was like a central figure within them. Essentially, what Hastings would do would go to a meeting, then he would go to Atif's house unannounced after the meeting, where he would hang out with him, and then we see the sort of the classic way these undercover officers would like put together, you know, the different places they'd go. They'd heard things attributed to different people, and as Atif said, you know, the international solidarity movement at the time was overwhelmingly white Western. He himself is a person of color. He's a brown man, or somebody of Asian descent from his family. Has a Muslim name, if you will. Though himself isn't religious. And, you know, there was, you know, a real racial profiling of him, like kind of sticking any form of like political activity that he could to him. We kind of saw the way in which he really ingratiated himself into Atif's life. He was, you know, the DJ at Atif's sister's wedding. You know, he said, you know, there was a lot of detail that Robert Hastings was like kind of privy to. He talks about the way in which they sort of connected as men, in a way in which it's not necessarily easy for men to connect. And talk to him about the kind of the really upsetting kind of dark parts of his family history. And he thought that they were sharing. He thought a lot of the things that he said, you know, he really fell for the legend, not the real man, but who the man purported to be. And we had like lots of detail about the way he kind of got himself into his life. It was interesting when we saw his reports that he kind of talked about like kind of he was tasked against Islamic-inspired terrorism. Now, Atif Choudhury, I mean, had been involved as an activist, certainly not Islamic-inspired and certainly not terrorism, but actually very early on into, by the time Robert Hastings had appeared on the scene, he was putting all his effort into Zaytoun, which is the fair trade olive oil company. They also import dates and other products directly from Palestinian farmers into the West. And he talked about the way in which that process has been really badly damaged, quite literally in the case of many of the shipments, destroyed, smashed up, sent to the wrong port, sent to different countries, about he personally going to Palestine, having to go through Israel to go to Palestine to sort out these shipments, being strip searched on the runway, held for hours by Shin Bet, how the intelligence reports that Robert Hastings had compiled upon him appeared to have been given to Shin Bet. Such was the nature of the questions that he was being asked by them. It certainly seemed to be a connection between the British security services and those of Israel. This is something we've seen before. We heard about it from Lord Peter Hain when he was giving evidence about the way in which South African boss, the security services from apartheid South Africa, appeared to have, you know, very intimate knowledge of anti-apartheid solidarity activists from the UK. There was a lot.
Also, Special Branch had a contact person with the South African embassy where Moss was stationed in London, and we've seen Peter Hain, and I think I'm not quite sure whether this was reports from the inquiry or ones that I found at the National Archives, but there were meetings between Special Branch and those so-called diplomats at the South African embassy, which were clearly boss agents. So there was an direct exchange of intelligence, and the South African government, of course, was very sensitive to the boycott movement of the 1970s, and equally, the Israeli Secret Service has their fingers in all kinds of pots here in London, trying to undermine activists and trying to sort of stir up legal cases against people. Well, we've seen so much of that in the past few months.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think I think there's a real parallel between that kind of activity and then what we heard earlier in the week from Simon Wellings about claiming that MT was an Arab who was supposedly intending to visit Gaza and Nablus. Soon afterwards, there was attempting the suicide bomb attack on Ariel Sharon. These spurious things that get able to put into files, hyping up the threat of Palestinian solidarity into being some form of Islamic terrorism, Islamic-inspired terrorism. Deeply disturbing, and I think really part of a wider picture of the way in which the British surveillance state treats I think lots of different forms of international solidarity, but there is something particular about Palestinian solidarity which gets targeted by the state. I think this is a huge area, as you say. We see it today. We see it with the prescription of Palestine Action. We see it in the way in which the recent Home Secretaries have referred to Palestine solidarity marches as hate marches, with no credible evidence to back up. Just really quite a chilling nature. One of the many chilling aspects of the undercover police deployment. And I think it's worth repeating that as much as Wellings kind of came across as a terrible intelligence officer, and I think he genuinely was terrible at gathering intelligence, he still had a very important use as far as the British state were concerned when it came to political repression. And I think that this is a key thing, that being bad at actual intelligence didn't stop the undercover officers being useful in the role that their managers were sending them out to do, which was, as we've heard, much later on, Mark Kennedy talked about one of the members of his target group being a drunk who talked a lot of shit whilst a few pints deep. And that was really good for us, because even though they knew it was nonsense, it was things that they could report as if they were real. And I think that's a key part of it all. We heard a bit about the exit, Hastings claiming his mother had cancer, and that bit, and when Atif sort of talked about that, he kind of he said for many years, when he got married to his wife, a woman that he met through Hastings, which he talked quite. There's a whole bunch of detail about that, which, though not subject to restriction order, I'm afraid was said during the hearings at the time when the reporting restriction order was in place. Just quickly on that, I've made representations to the inquiry about this matter. In the past, I've been able to report what is said around a piece of privacy, a restricted privacy item, something that's said that shouldn't be said, that leads to somebody being identified. But because of the draconian approach of the inquiry during this tranche, I now have to follow to the letter the reporting restriction orders that exist a minute or two either side of that particular piece of information. That means that I think some of the power of what was a very moving testimony by Atif Choudhury, I think, was lost because there were so many very minor privacy restrictions required. But yet this sort of elephant gun approach, the scattergun approach of the inquiry to prevent anything being said, minutes either side of it, means there's a lot of detail, which really, I think, highlights the deep disturbing and sadistic actions of this undercover officer, which affects people's lives to this day. And that was the end of the week. Eveline, is there anything else you want to add about Maya or Atif's testimony?
There's something else I want to say that I discussed with other people this week, and that is that, of course, this is also the era where the internet starts to become bigger, and we're starting to use it as activists. And we'll come to more to that next week when Rob Hastings is on the stand. But we've said that Wellings copied a lot from mailing lists and from what he gleaned from online events. Were this just the first few undercovers that started using the internet, or were they sort of the beginning of something bigger? Because as we always say now, is that if people ask us, is undercover policing at this scale still happening? We always say, like, well, we don't know, but what we do know is that there's so much for them to find online that there's less of a need. In some ways, that's another story, but in some ways, there's less of a need to invest so much time and money in infiltrating people into groups. But the entire side of what they glean from the internet and how and the start of the units that were to surveillance online happened in this era of time, and so we have to wonder whether Wellings and Hastings were sort of the vanguard of the new online undercovers, or who they were followed by, like which units were set up and how they were linked to the undercover officer teams. Is a question that hasn't been addressed at the inquiry yet at all. It might be missed, it's not in the remit of the inquiry in so many words. So it is up to us to push for it to include that.
Yeah, that's a really key area. Bristle, did you have anything overall you wanted to add, or maybe some of the points you were trying to make earlier when you got cut off?
Yeah, sorry about that. I would echo Eveline saying I think it's going to be an interesting few days of evidence from Hastings next week, because there's such a vast quantity of evidence relating to that, and it's very much going to be a compare and contrast exercise, because you've got time-coded entries that he was writing at the time, and we're going to be able to compare it against events that he was reporting on within Special Branch. And not only that, real life events that were having an impact on people around him whilst he was undercover. So, it's going to be very much aligning different diaries to see what he was saying, where he was saying it, and what the reason behind it was. As Eveline says, it's going to be interesting to find out more about whether these were, as you say, at the vanguard, or whether there were other instruments in place at that time. I'm sure we all remember in that period in the mid-2000s where there were various issues of police posting under different identities on things like Indymedia, issues with the Bristol Indymedia server seizure, things like that, where it was connecting movements in this country with movements elsewhere. So the Bristol Indymedia seizure was connected with activists in Europe at that time. So there was a certain amount of cooperation and information and intelligence sharing between UK police and the police overseas, not just in relation to summit hopping, but everyday domestic operations. So yeah, I think Hastings, as you say, evil. It's after hearing Maya's evidence this week, it is difficult to comprehend a man in terms other than of that level of amorality and immorality in terms of what he's prepared to do, and at the same time he was being supervised. So kind of looking forward to hearing about the impressions of his managers at the time as well, because the amount of time he was online, that cannot have just all been in his spare time. He had to have been doing it in work office environments as well. it had to have been something that he was discussing with colleagues and managers. Whether he was doing it autonomously or under direction from someone else, I think that will be interesting. But yeah, no, lots of questions at this stage. I'm not sure we're going to get truthful answers next week, but I think we are shining a light on something that has been hidden in darkness for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's going to be a fascinating week. The final week of field officers at the inquiry next week. We'll have Emily Apple on Monday, and then Tuesday through till Thursday, it'll be HN18, the Robert Hastings, the undercover police officer who used the cover name Rob Harrison. Just had some comment. We did have some comments. I should have put some of these up earlier. The fact these alcoholic, misogynist, racist abusers use the term legend is sickening to the core. Maya was incredible and deserved none of the years of repeated abuse. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, massive solidarity with Maya. It was one of the heaviest and saddest days of the inquiry. I really think it was. I mean, I've been to every day of the inquiry, and I think Maya's evidence was objectively the worst. Atif and Chris the next day was a lot easier to listen to. Robert Hastings' behaviour illustrated beyond doubt that the spy cops achieved nothing of value. It's been and remains a long-standing, ongoing exercise in fascist sadism. I think certainly sadism is the only word I could really use to describe Robert Hastings. And lies, obviously the lies and defrauding the public purse. Apparently it's all tickety-boo when the pigs do it. Just kind of responding to the stuff about the scrutiny, the online stuff. Backdoors into people's emails, talks about the heartbleed bug, and that thing of using overseas forces in order to avoid UK law. That's pretty much it for this week. I really encourage people. On Thursday, Atif brought in a big box of dates for us all, and reminded us all that the best dates in the world are Palestinian dates. Really recommend their olive oil as well. It's excellent stuff. You can buy it online. You can find it in every branch of Oxfam. It's in a lot of supermarkets as well. It's the olive oil the undercover cops tried to stop. So I'd really recommend getting hold of some. Is there anything either of you would like to add before we sign off? It's been a fairly normal 1 hour recap of the week, which was always the original plan, and not the 3 hours we have done in the past. Yes, the best olives and dates. Yes, absolutely. Anything to add? If not, we'll see you all next week. It'll be the last one of this particular tranche. I probably won't do it on the Sunday. It'll be my first proper weekend off for ages without having the fear of going back into the inquiry. So we might do it the week after on a weekday. We'll recap what the lies we hear from Robert Hastings and look ahead to the June-July hearings where we'll be hearing from the managers, the men who oversaw the sadistic actions of the undercover officers. Thanks for all joining. I'll see you all on Monday morning, 10 a.m. for Emily Apple. Bye for now.
Thanks, and bye.